James Rollins is a master of the serial thriller, but his new series takes us back to the blockbuster world of science fiction fantasy. The Starless Crown gives us heroes and a young heroine who band together through broken landscapes and epic battles to try to stop an apocalypse. And along the way, Rollins reminds us why he's so good at captivating readers. As soon as this first book in the MoonFall Saga was released, it hit the New York Times bestseller list. James Rollins, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So you're one of the first authors that we have back, like, in person. You're one of the first people to kind of get out there.
It has been. I feel like I'm forging a trail. I was at a book signing in Houston. That was their first in-person event. And they're like, we're not sure anybody's going to show up. So they were curious whether people were going to remember. They're going to get back into their routine. Have they sort of gotten used to the fact that everything's virtual and they don't have to go to bookstores anymore? But I was surprised. They were very excited to be there. It was a good crowd. So as an author, I was thrilled, and I'm sure the bookstore owner was also very relieved to have decent-sized audience to come in and buy books and see an author speak again. It's pretty cool.
So your new book is The Starless Crown, and it's gorgeous. I mean, the visuals.
Yes.
It is. And you've got a beautiful book trailer, too.
The book trailer was fun because the Book Candy, who did the trailer, shout out to Book Candy, they've done a lot of trailers for my previous thrillers that I was writing, and so I thought, they've really never done fantasy before. So I approached them and said, would you be willing to do a fantasy trailer? And I think, that's a little bit out of our wheelhouse, but yeah, let's do it. And I think the reason why that trailer came out so well was that they were challenged at how to do their usual routine and produce a beautiful fantasy trailer. They did a beautiful job.
And the really cool thing, too, about that, evoking that world, is that this is a new world. You built a new world for this novel. Tell us about this. It's the first in a 4-part, is that right?
Correct, yep.
So this is the origin story.
This is book 1 of the MoonFall Saga. And why it's called the MoonFall Saga is that the story takes place on a planet that is tidally locked. Our moon is tidally locked around our planet, which means one side of the moon always faces the Earth. One side is internally in darkness, and this planet orbits its sun the same way. One side of the planet is blasted by the sun and burnt. The other side is forever locked in frozen darkness. And when that cataclysm occurred, very few survivors. They fled to the only habitable area of that planet, which is sort of the twilight band between the fire and ice, the temperate area where you can actually sort of survive. And I got the idea for that story initially just because I thought, I read about that in an astrophysicist's book about tidally locked planets. I thought, that's really cool. I thought, can anybody live on that planet? And so I talked to astrophysicists and they said, yeah, you actually could. Because of some of the thermodynamics of the planet, there will be a band that's actually theoretically habitable. So then I thought, well, that'd be a cool place to build a world. And so I started over about a decade doing post-it notes, scrawled notes, very crude maps. There's beautiful now maps of the book that are rendered by Saria Corcoran, a great cartographer. And so I just sort of piecing it together, playing with it in my head, and then I began to sort of see characters that can occupy that world, and it began sort of snowballing. And I remember approaching my agent about 7.5 years ago. I sent him an email. I still have that email. And I said, I have this idea for this story, but I don't know if I should be a thriller, if I should try to do a modern version of this story, maybe we discover a planet that's like this, or maybe the Earth stops spinning, or something really cool like that, or should I do a fantasy? And he was like, well, you're known as a thriller writer. Maybe you should just, do what you do best and do the thriller. But they said, then I laid out the story, which I'm not going to tell you all. The big tent poles that are going to hold up the story and how it ends and how it resolves. And he goes, oh, that is so cool. Forget what I just said. Do the fantasy version of that. And so that was sort of the push towards getting the story started and putting it on paper.
As I was reading it, I was feeling like the excitement of what it must be like to start forming that world and just having it sort of like roll through your brain. And
well, that's the greatest thing about being an author is you get to create your own world. And in this world, because that landscape is so harsh, you have these extremes of hot and cold, of ice and fire. You have the areas of the edges that are very extreme. And me being a former veterinarian, I want to make the biology to be authentic. So I consulted with xenobiologists. I leaned on my own background to try to think of how would life evolve in those harsh niches. And so I began building this whole bestiary that's going to fill this book. Some that are very helpful to the populace that's still surviving, others that are quite hostile. And then I got the idea, wouldn't it be fun to make this book sort of like a scientific naturalist journal? So throughout the book, you're going to see sketches, like the meerbats, these gigantic carnivorous bats, and the other weird creatures that populate that world. So I want you, when you're reading the book, to have this feeling like you're reading an old naturalist's history of this planet, along with this big roller coaster of an adventure.
And the story begins with your heroine, a 14-year-old girl named Nyx.
Right, that's where I had the idea, but it didn't really come together until I began to get a hint of this character, and just glimpses, the color of her hair, what magic she might possess, if you can call it magic, even though I don't really use magic in this story per se. And she was orphaned as a baby. She was born near blind. She can see light and shadow, but little else. Then during a horrible moment, she gets attacked by one of the very poisonous, dangerous creatures of this land, and her heart stops beating. She has a fever dream of the moon crashing into the planet and destroying all life. She wakes up from this dream, not quite sure if it was just a fantasy in her head or what, but it felt so real, it felt prophetic to her. And reinforcing that is when she wakes up from this poison-induced dream, her vision has cleared. Now she can see for the first time. And she tries to explain what happened, why she believes this to be true, but in this world that's at the cusp of a major war, prophecies of doom are not welcome. So she has put a band of allies together to try to see, is their prophecy real? And if so, is there any way of stopping the moon from crashing into the earth? How would you ever do that? And so that begins the quest of the story the first steps you're going to see in the Starless Crown.
When you're creating a story like this, especially fantasy, and a cast of characters for this world, where does that first character emerge? Are they there from the very beginning, or do they come to you as you start to figure out because she's such a fascinating, multifaceted character, and I wondered, how does she kind of take birth in your brain even?
I always like to explore different characters. I wanted to see, what would it be like if you were born near blind and spent the first 14 years of your life living in shadows, basically. She's not totally blind. She can see light and darkness. She can see shadows moving, but it's almost like a veil is across her eyes. And if that veil was pulled away, how would she adjust to that? Most people might think, oh, it's a blessing. You can see your sight's returned. But for her, it's a bit of it's a scare. It's her world has changed abruptly. She's discomfited by it. So I like that idea of bringing, sort of shining a light on that type of character that's in transition. So she came more out of the landscape than anything else. And I do that a lot with my stories, is I will build the world, a little bit of the plot, and then I start thinking, like, who's going to drive the story? Who's the best one to tell the story? And I wanted the eyes of somebody relatively innocent. Now, the allies she brings together are not quite so innocent. There's a grizzled old broken knight who has to come to her aid. There's a recalcitrant thief whose allegiance is questionable. There's a second-born prince who's dealing with the fact that he's born second-born, and his brother is now begun to become king, and there's some friction going on there. So, but I wanted to take that reader into the world through the eyes of that young girl, so that she's going to be the vehicle in which this world opens up for everybody.
I wonder too, she's 14, so we can allow the story to grow with her.
Exactly. Over the course, of these 4 books, we'll see almost about a year passes between each book. So you'll see her develop almost about 18, 19 when the story, I anticipate she'll be by the time the story's over.
You have also written a middle grade series.
Right.
And I wondered, was this a way to sort of bring some of that world or that readership into this? Because if this feels like a book that I could give to a teen.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's a book I'm hoping that the YA audience will accept. And I had a book list review which really captured exactly what I was trying to do. They were saying, this could almost pass as a YA novel. Yes, there's some adult, themes that just borderline, maybe not YA, but at the same time, adults that read it are going to appreciate the story from a slightly different viewpoint than a YA reader might. And that's exactly what I want. I want to be right on that cusp, and as the story goes on, as my readership ages along with the books, I want them to experience, how Nick's changes.
And I love the idea that you could pull in this whole new generation of readers, and yet still staying very true to what your regular readers expect or look forward to.
Yeah, especially since it's such a fantastical world. You need a character that's going to be able to take the reader by the hand, and as they're innocently being exposed to this world, the reader is also carried with them. So I like that viewpoint. Now, there's multiple viewpoints from the other these adult characters, but I liked that main character being the one taking the reader by the hand.
And I know that throughout the promotion of this book, one of the questions you've had to sort of encounter a lot is your own origin story with writing fantasy, because a lot of people are saying, "Oh, why fantasy? Now you're known as a thriller writer," but your own origin story is fantasy.
Exactly. I sort of stumbled upon it, and when I was I wrote a bunch of short fiction that's buried in my backyard, never seen the light of day. You don't want to read that stuff. And I wrote my first novel, and it got rejected by 49 different agents. It was the 50th agent that saw something in this story that she thought she could sell. I was not convinced of that at that point, because I had 49 other agents who said this is unpublishable. So, it takes a while to get 49 different rejections. So during that period of time, I thought, well, maybe I'm not a thriller writer. Maybe I should jump into another genre that I love to read, which is fantasy. So I started working on a fantasy novel, and when I got that call from the agent, I was about 3/4 of the way through that fantasy story, and she said, "Hey, what are you working on next, Jim? Besides this book that I think I can sell, I'd like to know, be able to say this is what he's also working on." I said, "Oh, well, I'm working on this fantasy story that I'm very excited about." She goes, "Oh, no, I don't like fantasy. I don't know any of the fantasy authors. Stop writing that. Give me another thriller." Now, being me, after I had 49 different rejections, my answer to her was, "Yes, of course, I'll do that." That was a lie. I was 3/4 of the way through that novel. I wasn't going to stop. So I thought, well, I'm going to just finish this, see if she has any success finding a home for the thriller. Well, I finished the novel. I submitted it to a contest. And unbeknownst to me, one of the judges of the contest that year happened to be Terry Brooks, the international bestselling fantasy author of the Shannara series. And he liked it enough that he gave it to his editor. So suddenly, just out of the blue, I got a 3-book fantasy offer from Del Rey Books. I called my agent and said, "Hey, I think I sold my fantasy series. Would you help me do the contract?" She said, "Sure, I love fantasy. Sure, I'm glad to." Only at 15% to really goad them on.
How quickly that happened.
Exactly. Switched around. She goes, and by the way, I also have 2 publishers currently bidding on your thriller. So I went from, unpublished, and then a week later, suddenly I had, 2 different publishing houses, 2 different genres.
People fighting over you now.
And it became very confusing. So that's how I ended up running a fantasy year and a thriller year for quite a while.
Yeah. So speaking of origin stories, you grew up here in St. Louis, spent a lot of your formative years, went to your veterinary degree is from Mizzou, right?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, I know you've talked about this, you were really raised to be a reader and a writer. This was such a huge formative part of your childhood, is just falling in love with books.
Yeah, my mom was a big reader, and she wouldn't let us turn the television on when she was reading. So you're doing this, so I thought, well, I might as well read because nothing else to do. So there was no she didn't put a gun against her head and said, "You must read this." So I started reading as a young age. If you read enough, eventually you think, wouldn't it be cool to write something, to walk to a bookstore and see your book on the shelf? And there's also just a part of me that's a little twisted. I had 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and they were my earliest audience for my storytelling. I call it storytelling. Mom called lying. Tomato.
I know.
And my goal was basically just to spin stories that would terrorize my younger brothers and sisters. If tears were involved, all the better. And that's pretty much what I'm doing today, is I just want to, terrorize my readers, and if tears are involved, all the better. So I haven't really changed much from that. But when you read and you have that part of the personality that likes to spin stories, it's like throwing gasoline on that corner of your brain. And it's hard to dismiss that. But I loved science, I loved medicine, I loved animals. I wanted to be a veterinarian since third grade. That's my career track towards. But I kept reading, and it's a part of me that just couldn't quite let it go. And finally, I joined a little writers club in Sacramento where I had set up my practice, and it was just going to be a hobby. Like I said, but I didn't have any aspirations of changing my career.
Nothing to lose.
No, I just wanted to, maybe at some point get a short story sold, or which never happened, or get a book on the shelf. And now, 40 books later, I have a bookshelf on this thing. But it's a strange process. My parents were a little confused by the whole, what are you doing with this whole career? My clients were suspicious. I had posters in my lobby. Get your cat spayed, get a free book. So questions arose across the table eventually, like, Dr. Jim, you have a successful veterinary practice. What's this business with writing? Why, what's your long-term career goals? And go, well, as I'm draining your dog's anal glands, I will try to answer that if I can. For 15, 20 years, writing was my paycheck, and veterinary medicine was a paycheck, and writing was just a hobby. And maybe down the line somewhere, I might reverse that, where I'll have, writing will be my paycheck, and veterinary medicine will be my hobby. And I'm pretty much there because I can still neuter a cat in under 30 seconds. I still work with a group that traps feral cats in the Sacramento area, and for 8 hours every Sunday I spay and neuter them. Or not every day, one Sunday a month, I should say. And so I'd like to keep my toe in that pool a little bit, keep my scalpel sharpened just in case.
Your website is great, too, because you provide a lot of resources
I do.
for aspiring writers, which I think is just lovely to be able to share what you've learned.
Yeah, I like, rather than having everybody having to reinvent the wheel like I felt somewhat like I had to do, is, I've learned a lot, and a lot of it can be taught fairly quickly. And so I like to narrow down a lot of the fluff that's out there into this is exactly the steps you need to do. And I like my website. My website I always describe it as my encyclopedia of James Rollins. A lot about the books and interviews and thoughts and blogs and Q&As and section about writing. And social media I use as, basically as a way of communicating with my readership. And I like that because I test drive a lot of my concepts with my audience through social media. And my thriller at one point at the end of one of the books, Gray, who's a member of Sigma Force, is in bed with somebody, but you don't know which woman he's in bed with. There's two women that have sort of been circling, and you're not quite sure who he ended up with, whether it was Rachel or whether it was Seishan. And to be honest with you, I didn't know who he was with. So that's why I left it a mystery. I thought, I'm not sure who I want him to end up with. And when I was done the book, I thought, well, I got to figure it out. So I just put it out on social media. Vote. Who do you think Gray should be with? And so I like bouncing that out. I do title, I practice titles with people. What do you think of this title? Or here's my 3 titles. Which do you like the best? So I like having that feedback I get through social media with an audience.
What is your favorite part of the process? I'm sure it's hard to choose because it's all wrapped up together. But
it is. When you have that first idea for the story, it's like a bright, shiny penny in your head, and it just shines, and it's hard to let that go. And that's what happened with this story is that it was developing, and it was sort of always there. It was always calling to me, even when I was writing other stories. And until I put it on paper, it's always sort of making noise at the back of my head until I put it on paper and it quiets down. So when you first start a novel, that's really thrilling because you're starting to explore your world. Finishing a novel is really satisfying, trust me. Getting to that last page there's horns going off, there's celebrations, there's champagne popping. The worst part, though, is the middle of the book. Every time I get to the middle of the book, I become convinced that I've lost all talent. This is the end of my career. This is the book that's going to be the nail in my coffin. I'm going to have to pay back my advance. This is the end of it. And I just put my head down and get to the end of the book, and it was actually fine. I don't know what I was worried about. Well, I'll never do that again. Well, I'm working on my 40th book right now. Still happens. Every single book, I get to the middle of the book, I just have this moment of total terror that this is not going to work out.
And I know you've mentioned, too, that you walk a fine line between planning out your stories and not over-controlling them either.
Yeah, and there's different schools of thought, and they're all right. I know where this book's going to end. I know the last line of this series, even before I wrote the first line. And I know the big tent poles that are going to hold up that story. But I don't know how A connects to B, connects to C. To me, one of the fun parts of writing is that unknown, is seeing where the story is going to surprise me. And I believe readers have a great nose on them. They have a great ability to sense when an author is sort of bored with their own material. I always say you should be writing from a point of passion, and to keep my passion going is that unknown is what sort of gets me excited to sit down again and see where the story's going to take and what the characters are going to do and see how they surprise me. Whereas if I knew it in too great detail, I think I might get a little bored with it, and somebody might sense that. So I'll never really work from an outline.
That's what keeps it fresh for you.
Yeah.
In the Starless Crown, any surprises that you encountered yourself as you were writing it in terms of your characters?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's all the time. Even there's a whole major character in this. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want people like to study my novel and go, why did he? That was never in any part of my story. He just totally came out on the paper. I just needed this character. I thought it was going to be just a step on the stage and wave and then disappear. Major character in the storyline now, and did not anticipate that was going to happen.
You said that you know where your stories are going to end. So what's that like in a situation like this where you've got 4 books and you're going to be telling this story through 4 books, but do you already know how this series is going to end?
Yeah.
Wow.
I do.
Wow.
I know the very last line. The last line's great.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Where does the last line come, like, very early in your whole process then, too? Or
It came. I can't say exactly when it came. As I was structuring it, I just saw this is where it's going to land, and then I thought, well, who's going to tell this part of the story? I got to be careful what I'm saying. And then I thought, okay, I know what he's going to say, and then it just popped in my head.
how about your titles, too? Did they come to you, or
Titles are hard
are they
for
a
me.
negotiation?
They're a negotiation.
Yeah.
Titles are, as my publisher will say, is a marketing tool. Is that I will generally give them like about 6 or 7 titles, and they will take it to sales, and they'll see what seems to resonate best with everybody, and so we'll sort of go a little bit back and forth. I'll go, I don't really like that one the best. Of the 2, let's go this way instead of that way. So I'll give them a little bit of guidance, but it's a tough call.
Yeah. Where are you at now in the process of the series, too?
I'm working on the just about finished the second book. I should have the second book done by the next couple weeks after I get back from the tour.
This is the first time I've interviewed an author that also has another book in another series coming out in the spring, right?
Coming out in April.
Right.
So that's Kingdom of Bones. It's a part of the Sigma Force universe, Sigma Force Thrillers. Sigma Force is a group of special forces agents that work for DARPA. They deal with scientific threats to the world, so they're a great deal of fun. They're in a lot of trouble in the next book.
So one question I meant to ask you earlier, you grew up, as you said, reading and telling stories. I think I read one story where you said your mom would take you to a library, all of you to a library, on a Saturday and say...
that was a... I think it's supposed to get rid of 7 kids that she had. There's like, just let them loose. It's the library's problem now. I'm going to go back here and read quietly and let them just wreak havoc in here. So, yeah,
My mom used to do the same thing, actually. That's why I thought it was funny, too. You wouldn't see them for a couple hours, right?
I just crawl around the floor and I'd find a book. If I'm Danny Dunn mystery when I was real young, I'd lay on my back and feet up on the library shelves, and I just already start reading until Mom calls you.
That was my next question. What were your favorites, and how did that sort of lead you to what you write now?
I've always been leaning towards the, any type of genre fiction. And I read a wide gamut of different material. I mean, I love science fiction. I love fantasy, which should be self-evident. But I also like military thrillers. I like horror, big Stephen King fan, big Dan Simmons fan. Not so much literary fiction. I mostly have a tendency to lean more towards the genre type of stuff. And whenever I teach writing, I also say you should write what you love to read, which is a challenge for me because I love to read so many things. So like my Sigma Force novels, they're definitely have a military thriller element to them, but they have a fantastical element to them. They have weird science in them, so a little science fiction-y there. So I found that writing is everything I love to read is what I love to write. And even this Starless Crown, I describe as a scientific fantasy, because though it is definitely a full-blown, full-blooded, full-throated fantasy novel with the typical things you might expect to see in a fantasy that I'm going to take you in different ways, but also there's a lot of weird science that's in there that's buried in, like the evolutionary history of these creatures and how things grow, and so it's a blend of a little bit of science and a little bit of fantasy.
Now, you live in a gorgeous area, and you're a dog parent. Is that right?
Yes, 2 dogs.
That's right. How does the natural surroundings and just even your pets, sort of inform some of your storytelling too? I mean, where you live is just...
Oh yeah, I love the natural world. It's one of the reasons I was my undergraduate degree was evolutionary biology, which is not probably hard if you read my novels. You could probably guess that. I like just that the breadth in which life expresses itself, and you'll see that echoed in a lot of my novels. I have a series with Tucker and Kane. Tucker is a former Army Ranger. Kane is his military war dog. And I wrote that novel both from Tucker's point of view and from the dog's point of view. So the whole scene's written from the dog's point of view. But I didn't want to make it like a Disney dog that broke out into song halfway through the novel. I wanted to make it all as authentic as possible. So I interviewed handlers from Iraq all the way back to here. I went to Lackland Air Force because they trained. So even though it might seem fantastical to write from the point of view of a dog, I tried to make it as authentic to really take people and put them in that shoe. So you'll see a lot of animal sidekicks. I did a sign language speaking gorilla named Baco in one of my books. And again, he was a point of view character, so he was a great deal of fun to write. In Starless Crown, there's a whole bestiary of strange creatures, some that are allies to our heroes, others that are inimical to them.
One of the first things I noticed, even just starting to read the Starless Crown, and then even in talking with you now, is like, I'm like, this is a guy who just like loves what he does. Like you just that just comes across from the page.
Well, good. I mean, that's like a goal. Is like I said, if readers have that great nose on them, and I think if you're excited about the material as a writer, that's they'll sense that when they're reading the book too.
Right, and gives you such a connection to the author to think like,
yeah,
you're right, he's enjoying himself too.
There's the old adage, writers are naked on the page. I think we expose a lot more about our psyche and our personalities because it should be coming off that page. You should have that almost psychic bond with that reader as you're telling the story. You always think of it as I'm telling the story as that the reader is there with me. I'm still like that kid, terrorizing my younger brothers and sisters, in the living room. Now I'm just doing the same thing on a bigger scope of, I'm telling the story, but you're the audience. My goal is to, can I get you to cry? I'm going to make you cry before this is over.
James Rollins, thank you so much for talking with us. It has been so enjoyable.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.